So, welcome, Damian Hughes. I can't even believe I'm saying that right. To the latest series of hashtag Lee Rogers Meets.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Lee. I think what you're doing is brilliant. I love the idea of that when you explained it about the social glue is one thing that we're all missing in lockdown. So, trying to just create opportunities to have a chat and a catch up is such a brilliant, innovative idea. So, thank you for asking me. I'm really honoured.
Oh, honestly, it's I wax lyrical, but even my wife said, like, I've just said, oh, well, I'm gonna speak to Damian. She's like, oh, is he the guy you keep going on about? Like, yeah, yeah, he is actually. Yeah,
Yeah.
he is.
Oh, well, that's a nice change because my wife would say, "Oh, you just, like stop, keep going on." That's what I get. So, so thank you.
So, how's lockdown treating you?
Generally good. And I don't mean to be flippant about that, but I'll give you like when it first happened. I remember saying to my wife that I thought it could be a really interesting opportunity to go back to something that we'd experienced about 10, 11 years beforehand. So I'll give you some context that my when my son was when we found out we were expecting my son, he's 11 now. Um, Both my wife and I went, we don't know anything about parenting. Like you don't know what you don't know. And I had a friend of mine that was doing a parent skills course. And I said to my wife, should we go on it? Should we just go and find out? We might get something useful. So we both went on this parents course. And one of the first exercises they did was brilliant. They said, just divide us up into groups. And he went, write down your best memories of childhood. So we were in separate groups, we did it, and then we came back and the lady who was facilitating the course got it all up and she sort of read them out and she said, what do you notice the common themes? And there was two themes that came out of everybody's best memories. One was you had your mum or dad there, so you had a parent or a carer present in those best memories. And the second thing was it was about doing activities that didn't actually cost anything. It was like being in the park, going for a walk, kicking a ball around, and it was all like simple low tech stuff. And it stuck in my mind at the start of lockdown that I thought, one, we're going to be around, which was a real privilege. But then secondly, it was like, and we can go and do stuff that doesn't require big investment, doesn't require you to have the best facilities. You can just go for a walk and have a chat on the way and things like that. So I've really consciously tried to embrace that kind of mindset of just being around and being present for my wife and my children more than anything, because prior to that, I'd spent an awful lot of time traveling and being away and you juggling demands. So I've tried to be optimistic about it and view it as a real opportunity to do those kind of things that, like I say, 11 years prior, I'd been reminded of them.
I'm not just like playing it back to you because to glorify that, but I completely resonate, right? Because one of the things I say is, I used to be a primary school teacher and then
Right.
been fortunate to be a parent later in life, and it was a challenge to have Ella through IVF. But the two things I say is that kids want time and they want love, and beyond that, it is kind of superficial, actually. So, and I think it really resonates with what you've just said. And this time, particularly around lockdown, is and being curious around what does it give you, and actually what will life look not back to normal, because I don't think we'll ever go back to
Yeah,
normal because we've started to do things differently, quite frankly.
definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I think what's interesting is that, like from a professional point of view, I think when was the last time you were forced to go back and change your mind on something big? And the reality is, it happens all too infrequently. Do you know what I mean? So when people go, oh, oh, when we get back to normal, you go, as exactly like you said, well, why don't you adapt? Because it might not go back to normal, But that to me is the equivalent of people that go, oh, kids are different these days. And you go, compared to when? You go, well, when I was a kid. And you go, well, that was 30 years ago. Do you not believe the world's changed in any other way? Do you not believe kids are conditioned differently? Well, yeah, of course. And what you hear is the last time that person thought about childhood was when they were living through their own childhood. So they've never stopped to think of it from somebody else's perspective. So they've never had to change their mind about what the world is like. And a bit like what lockdown's done is it's forced us all to go back and assess and change our mind on some important things. And the ones that are shouting loudest are the ones that seem to be struggling most to go back and change their mind.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So talk to me a little bit about, I guess, the milestones in your career. What's been some of the highlights?
Right. Okay. Well, my background, you'd probably class it as relatively unusual, I suppose. That I'm from North Manchester, but I grew up in a boxing gym. So my dad was a boxing coach, and he'd been a coach long before I was born. So my playground, from as long as I can remember, was being in and around the gym, running around, climbing ropes, getting in the ring, and things like that. And that's all I ever knew. Now, like anybody that doesn't particularly know boxing gyms, the sort of perception is they're often based in sort of gritty inner city areas, and that was exactly the case in terms of where I grew up and the environment. Um, but what I always think is it did two things for me. That when I went on and did further studies at university, there was a really nice phrase that we used to talk about. You don't do research, you do me search. And most of our life is spent trying to make sense of what's happened to us. And it's only, I suppose, when I reached adulthood did I realise what my background and environment had given me. The first thing was I was around high performance from literally as my earliest memories. And what I mean by that was I was around lads that were going off to Olympic Games to represent the country in the boxing, lads that were amateurs and then went on to become professional fighters and win world titles. And I think what I saw was the work in the shadows that high performance. So I didn't get blinded by the outcome of somebody winning a medal or winning a title. I saw the hard work, the graft, the sacrifice, the effort, the evaluation, all of that stuff was what I was being given, if you'll excuse a pun, like a ringside seat to. And I think that always that journey in the shadows always intrigued me in terms of high performance and how you create that. But then the second thing was I was around high performing cultures that really did shape professionally what I do now. I wouldn't have articulated it as that as a kid, but I was around an environment where I would estimate 70% of the people that came in that boxing club never came in there to box. 70% of them came in to escape the difficulties of life, the unemployment, the challenges, the struggles that they were going through, and to come into a place where they were respected, where they were treated with courtesy. They were people gave them kindness and just recognised them for who they were. And I think that really shaped me an awful lot in terms of what I went on to do. So I'll give you a nice sort of end to the story in many ways. That 3 years ago, Manchester Council named a road after my dad in honour to the work that he'd done in Manchester in the Colliest area of the city. And it was like a really bitterly cold January afternoon when we had it. We had like Andy Burnham, the mayor, came and cut the ribbon and that. But again, I'd say out of about 300 people came, and the vast majority of them weren't there as former boxers. The vast majority of them were to talk about what that culture had done in shaping them as people, as partners, as parents, as professionals. It was almost like the impact of how culture can shape you if you get it right and if you harness the power of it. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, I suppose, Lee, but that was my earliest memories and what I experienced as a kid were all things that have shaped me subsequently and shaped like my values. And I can often recall so many of the lessons were in there. So I'll give you like one of my values is like treat people with kindness, like treat yourself, but treat other people with kindness. And where I date that back to was when I was a kid, I was about 14 and I was in the boxing ring and I was sparring and I found myself overmatched. So I was better than the lad who was in the ring with me. Now, in the kind of culture that my dad had established in the boxing club, in a situation like that, you help and you coach and develop the person that you're with. But I was a 14-year-old idiot and didn't. So I ended up taking a liberty with the kid, like pushing him around a bit, throwing shots at him that I knew he couldn't stop, and I hurt him. And it went on and we sparred. And as I was getting out of the ring, my dad came over and stopped me getting out. He said, "You stop in the ring." He said, "Where are you going?" I went, "I've finished." And he went, "Nah." He said, "That's not a workout." He said, "Stop in, just do a few more rounds." And then he threw in a young professional boxer with me. And the next 9 minutes were the most humiliating 9 minutes of my life, where this lad got in the ring with me. He was a lot better than me. And he didn't physically hurt me, but mentally he did. He sort of just embarrassed me. He slipped shots. He kept knocking my head back. And I was aware that everybody was just watching me get served a big slice of humble pie. And as I got out of the ring, like I couldn't even speak. The tears were stinging my eyes. And my dad said to me, "How do you feel?" And I was sort of trying not to cry. And my dad said to me, "How you feel now is exactly what you did to that boy just before." And even let me emphasize a point. He said, "Never, ever take a liberty with anybody in any aspect of your life." Now that's 35 plus years ago, and I can still recall it with real, like it still makes the hairs on the back of my neck. I still squirm with embarrassment when I think about what I did. But it's often like little moments like that that shape you in terms of the person that you hope you become, and the person that I hope my children do, that you pass on those lessons to them. So they were big ones. Other big events for me was that I'd probably go forward a good few years. So I worked as a coach when I left school. Well, actually, I'll tell you another one about school. I got a good. This is a powerful lesson, and given that you were a teacher yourself, I think you'd appreciate this. That I was the first one from a family that I got really lucky. I got a scholarship to a good school. And my mum and dad were really keen on emphasising the power of education because of our backgrounds, and they felt that that was like a great route for self-improvement. So I ended up getting a scholarship to a good school, but it was like a fish out of water, that I knew I was sort of very lucky to be there. And like most kids do in a situation like that, you think, how can I survive? So you either become the class clown and the joker, or sometimes you become almost like the tough guy. And I sort of found myself, because of my background, sort of falling into that tough guy role. And I ended up getting into scrapes and things like that. But then I got into one particular bad fight where the school expelled me and just said, "We're not having this nonsense off you." And they kicked me out. And what had happened was, about 2 weeks prior to this, I was an altar boy in the Catholic Church around where we grew up. And I can imagine it was an incongruous image. Like, you've got this altar boy that's also acting like a clown and messing about at school. But there was this teacher from the school that'd come into mass one day, and I could see him do a double take when he saw me on the altar. Right, this is 2 weeks before I got into trouble. And he'd asked me at school about what I'd done, about serving on the altar and things like that. And I told him, and he knew my dad, and he knew the sort of work in the community he was doing. And then I got into this trouble, and they were kicking me out, and there was murder at home. My mum and dad were furious with me and saw that I'd squandered this opportunity. And this teacher turned up at my house. He's called Bernard Council, and he turned up. And he spoke to my mum and dad, and he knew that they were good people, and he could see how hurt they was by how daft I'd been. And he went and stood up for me at school. He went and spoke to the teachers, and he explained that he knew I was from a nice family, and he said, "Listen, I'll take him under my wing." And it was made clear to me any other misdemeanors, and there was no second chance. But he basically spoke up for me when he didn't need to. And that had a real impact on me, because I think he was the first person that ever showed believe, like outside of my family, somebody that believed in me before I ever believed in myself. Somebody that said, "You're not a bad lad, you're not an idiot, you don't need to be going down this route of throwing your weight around to get by." And I always sort of think back to that moment of how lucky I was that I talk about this idea. Sigmund Freud talks about golden seed moments, where everybody in their life needs somebody that believes in them before they quite have that belief. And this Mr. Council was the one that did it for me. So there's a nice sort of arc to the story. But when I got my professorship from the university in Manchester Met, the Manchester Evening News, the local paper, did a feature on it. And one of the questions they asked was about teachers that had an impact. And I mentioned Mr. Council and talked about what he'd done for me. And his family got in touch with me to say you know, that it was always like a validation of all the years he'd done in teaching, and that was what he did it for, to try and make a difference for kids. And it's been nice that every year I made a promise then to him, and I've still maintained it, that I take him out for something to eat once a year, where I go and meet him. He's like 85 now, but we take him to a little restaurant near where he lives, and I just take him out and just chat with him. But it's my sort of quiet way of just trying to thank him, because there was no need for him to do what he did. And the fact that he did again, it was like a seminal moment in my life that really had an impact on me.
How many people have those moments as well, right? I'm sure people can resonate, like watching this. You know, I know my high school teacher, Mr. Maloney. It wasn't just for me though; it was for anyone he touched. You know, and I think he's still teaching in Manchester today, and doing a great job. And it's that moment where you go, I've become more than I ever thought was, you know, possible. So I first one to go to uni in my family.
Wow, right.
Started teaching. You know, I come from Sale, but it was like counsellor state.
Yeah.
Then I went on to do a postgrad. Now, had I not been instilled that, like you say, don't be the idiot, work as hard as you can. And my vehicle was through sport, actually.
Right.
Sport and discipline of be the best that you can be at what you do. You know, and that you've got to work. No one gives you anything on a plate.
Yeah.
But you do need that guidance. You do need that, or it's great you get given opportunities. And
I agree with
like,
you.
what do you do with that?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the powerful point. I think people can give you the opportunities, but you've got to be open to see it yourself. You know what I mean? Like I think about Mr. Counsel, like your teacher, where maybe he was there before it, but I was too stubborn or too pig-headed to recognise that he was giving you those opportunities. I think it was only that you have to open your own mind to see that there's always good people out there. You know, there's an old saying, isn't there, that if you can't find a good person, just be one. And I think when you start doing that, you attract people that go, oh, right, okay. And like kindness feeds on itself, being decent feeds on itself, I believe.
And you've definitely been kind enough to do this, so you know, and respond. So genuinely appreciate it. What have been some of the things then in your career that have been real challenges, or in your family life? You know, like your home life.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, because I think that you find out somebody, like there's two times I think when you find out somebody's real character. One, when you give them real power and see how they deal with it. And then secondly is when you see somebody get put on the backside and see how they deal with it. You know, like, do they get up and blame others, make excuses, point the finger, or do they take accountability and sort of bite down and come back and do the best they can? And I've certainly had my fair share based on my own mistakes or cock-ups or things like that, where you get put on your backside and taught a lesson. I remember one was, so I'm skipping in and around my career quite a lot, but I was a coach. I was a boxing and a football coach when I left school, and then I had this idea. I thought I needed to get a proper job. Like, nobody in my family we'd had a proper job, and I had this idea. I thought I need to get a proper job. And my girlfriend at the time, she's my wife now. Her dad had been a sales manager and things like that, so she knew a bit more about the corporate world. And she was like, "You're not really qualified to do a lot." She said, "But you could probably try HR." And I was like, "Okay, what's that?" And she said, "It's human resources." So I started applying to companies, and I said, "Listen, I've got this background in psychology. I've worked as a coach. I reckon I could do something in the corporate world." I said, "I don't know what I don't know, but I'll work really hard and I'll try my best." And so I ended up getting a job as an HR manager, right, for a company called Unilever. And when I told my mum what I was doing, I was leaving coaching and I was going down this route, and I told her HR. She said a question that only a mum can ever get away with asking you. She said, "What are you going to do when you get found out?" Right, and I went, "I don't know." I said, "But once it happens, I'll sort of bide my time and head off again." So I genuinely, because I didn't know anything about the corporate world, I didn't realise that you couldn't just get sacked like this. I came in as naive as this, thinking if they don't like it, they'll just say to you, oh, here's your cards, go. So I kept anticipating that I was going to get found out, right? But I came in and my work ethic was good, and I was trying my best, and because I didn't know what I didn't know, I was just doing the best I can, and every year I'd get a call off my boss, this fabulous man called Alan Walters. And I used to genuinely, for the first couple of years, I used to think, oh, damn, I've been found out. And I used to go in anticipating the next day I'd be giving me orders to go. And every time I went in, they kept promoting me instead. Right. So I ended up going to New York for a year to go and work out there on a project. And then the last big one I did was I went to not far from where your offices are in Port Sunlight on the Wirral. So I was looking after the factories there. And then the last job they took me to was I became HR director out in South Africa for them. Right, this is about 6 years. And it was a classic example of the Peter principle. You know, when you get promoted to your level of incompetence, right? So they made me a director at this. And I remember sat there, I was in Durban, right? And I was looking out at the Indian Ocean this one day. And I remember thinking, I'd give anything to be out there rather than in there, right? Because I felt like I didn't know what I was doing. And this debate was going around the table, right? It was Flora Margarine, it was called Bechamel Margarine out there. And I'm sat in this meeting about it, and sales had dipped in the region. I remember there was a part of me thinking, there's not one bit of me gives a shit about this. I don't care. There's not one bit. It doesn't affect my life. I'm not interested. And yet, so I'm watching the debate go around the table and all these other colleagues, and they all look genuinely devastated, as if they'd heard the worst news ever. And I remember it was like creeping death as the conversation's coming to me for my response to what we're going to do. I remember having this thought of, I genuinely don't care. There's not one bit of me cares. And then I remember thinking to myself, are you going to tell them that? I love this internal debate. Are you going to say, not bothered? And to my eternal shame, I didn't. I faked it. I pretended to be as upset as everyone else was sat around the table. But it was that night, and I went home to my flat, and I was sat there and I thought, you've got 30 years of pretending to be a fraud. You've got 30 years of phoning it in and doing what you've just done today. And I was really ashamed of myself for what I'd done. I thought, you're better than that. This isn't a life for me of pretending to give a shit about things that I don't. Now, I was fortunate I'd already written my first book at this stage, and I'd sort of had this idea of what I wanted to do. It wasn't fully formed, but I had an idea that I wanted to be independent and go and work with teams where I felt I could make a positive difference. So I often say that was the day that I mentally resigned. The day of the Bechamel Margarine debate was the day that I mentally resigned. I physically followed through about 6 months later, but that was the day when I thought, and that life's too short to be spending it doing something that you're not passionate about. And I don't want it to come across like I'm being snide or facetious about that job, because it wasn't. It was a really good job and they were good people, but it wasn't the right one for me. And I found myself almost like a square peg in a round hole. And I felt I owed it to not just myself, but to them as well, of don't do this if you're not passionate about it, if you're not sincere about what you're talking about. So that was like a real down point for me, because I was quite frightened. I don't downplay the fact that I was in a really nice job. I was getting handsomely paid. I was getting brilliant opportunities. And we didn't have children at the time, but my wife and I were obviously married. And I remember thinking, you've got obligations and duties here. You can't just walk away from this. And that's why I say mentally I resigned, but physically it took me another 6 months to work up the courage to follow through and formulate plans for what I wanted to do post corporate life.
So there's two things coming out here for me. And I hear it actually regularly from people in the corporate world and people I coach. Interestingly, is to say, actually, that moment again of when did I mentally resign? Because there was a given moment or a snapshot that went, actually, that is it, And then equally, what is the courage that it needed to take in order to take that next step to what it would be? The phrase I heard earlier was around, it's a long time to your pension.
Yeah, absolutely. And what would you want to live a life like? to me, that's inconceivable that you'd live a life waiting till you get to an age where to go and start enjoying yourself. That frightens me, to be quite frank. That I think what I realised was that the analogy that I used on myself was, it's like playing cards. Now, I'm not a big card player, but I know that there's always a moment when you're playing poker where you have to stick or twist. But you have to make a decision to do one or the other. You can't just be passive and let the game play around you. You have to go, you know what, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to stay with this, but I'm going to give it my absolute all and I'm going to enjoy it and I'm going to try my best to make a difference. Or that's where you go, you know what, I'm going to twist there and I'm going to hammer cards in and go and do something else. But the worst thing is, if you choose not to make a decision, the decision gets made for you, the game plays, and you've not played your part in it. And that's where I was worried about not doing that and then becoming bitter. You know, you see these bitter cynics, like the guy that, how long have you worked here? Well, since he threatened to fire me. That kind of attitude. I didn't want to be that. I didn't want to be that person. And that was a bit of a catalyst. But in terms of the courage stuff, I think it's not just about having courage, because you can't be reckless either, especially when you get to a state of having responsibilities. And I think what I'd done was, I alluded to it, I'd already written my first book. Now, I wrote this book with no intention of it ever coming out other than to a very small audience. So I'll give you the context that when I was working at Port Sunlight, it was the old Unilever factories on the Wirral. And I was looking after the 3 factories there. And I sort of worked really hard for about 3 years to be a part of turning performance around by sort of focusing on the culture and doing a lot of the stuff that I do now. And when I knew that I was going to leave, I wanted to almost give, it was mainly lads in the factory, but it was mainly the lads in the factory. I wanted to give them almost like a blueprint of everything we'd done so they could maintain it, but also do it themselves. And so we could keep the momentum going. And I was trying to find a book that I felt captured the key lessons of what we'd done. And I kept falling between 2 stools. If I gave them a book that was too academic as a textbook, they wouldn't read it. They'd just go, I'm not reading that. But if I gave them a book that was too flimsy, they were too cynical to take it seriously. They'd go, that's nonsense. That's not for me. So I was trying to find a book that captured a bit of the academic stuff, but equally that was practical, that you could get their head around. So in the end, I thought, I'll write it myself. So I didn't know what I didn't know about writing a book. So I set off and wrote this book. And when I was doing it, I was like making a list of people I liked and admired. And I thought, I'll go and interview them. I'll find out how to approach them. So again, my naivety ended up with me sort of spending time with Richard Branson, spending time with Alex Ferguson. I got to interview Angelo Dundee and Muhammad Ali as part of the research. So I did that as part of this book. And then what I did was I tested it with a couple of lads in the factory. And they looked at it and they went, yeah, Richard Branson's mum and dad was rich. That's why he was successful. And they went, Alex Ferguson got given Manchester United on the plot. And they always had a get out. If you wanted to be a cynic, they'd always say, this is why, and that's why I can't do it. So I had this last idea about doing the book. I thought, I know what I want to do. And because I'd been there 3 years and got to know most of the lads, I knew that there was some people in there that had some amazing stories to tell, right? So there was a lad who it was his dream to give his 2 daughters the education he'd never had. And he wanted to get them in the best school in the area, couldn't afford to move house. So he bought a plot of land and over 5 years built his own house on this plot of land that was in the catchment area to get his daughters in the best school. There was another lad that had built his own canal boat because it was his dream that he wanted to sail the canals of Britain. And there was people like that I knew their story. So I went and interviewed them. And what I wanted to show was the lad who'd built his house to get his daughters into school, he'd built his own little empire using the same mental tools that Richard Branson had done to build Virgin. The guy that had sort of set off to build this canal boat, he had the same drive and ambition that Alex Ferguson had had. And I wanted to show their story and show how their thought processes were exactly the same. So I went and interviewed these lads and I put their stories in between the chapters, right? And then I published a book just for the lads in the factory. So I self-published it and gave it to them all as a toolkit, because what it did was it removed any excuse for them that they go, yeah, Alex Ferguson was this, and then they go, but I know Steve on that line over there, and I went to school with him, and I know that he has the same background as I do. So it became harder to invalidate their claims when you know the person. So we ended up producing this book called Liquid Thinking that was just for the lads in the factory. And what happened was there was I don't know if it's still around because I've not been in that world for a long time, but there was the HR press had something called People Management magazine, right?
Yeah, subscribe to it, I think.
Right, okay, so they heard about it and they got in touch with me, and they ended up putting this story on the front cover of the magazine about this book and how we'd turned around performance through focusing on culture in the factory. So I started to get like lots of inquiries from people within sort of the corporate world saying, can you send us this book? We're interested. So what I was doing was, because I'd just produced it myself, I had some spare copies. I was sending them out to people and saying, if you want to make a donation, give it to my dad's boxing club. So it was that, and what had happened, and then I'd gone off to South Africa, but I had this idea of it. So I'd started writing the second book at this stage. And that was why I always had like a bit of a dream of what I wanted to do, but I invested my weekends and my evenings and any spare time in just developing this idea. So the courage, going back to that point, was I never like, courage is about jumping off a cliff that where the gap looks like that, but I didn't. I felt the gap was a lot shorter because I'd built up the seeds of an idea of where I wanted to go to, and that it still felt frightening, but it felt less daunting because I knew where I wanted to head to. It wasn't reckless of just throwing my lot in and then starting again.
So it's interesting the language you use, and I'm sounding a bit like you on the High Performance podcast saying that, I think. Sorry about that. So if you wouldn't call it courage, then what would you label it?
I'd call it pragmatism. I'd say it was about being pragmatic, so being able to pivot and be able to start building foundations. So it was very pragmatic of, I was building foundations to smooth my path from one place to another. I think, like I say, courage would be, or reckless courage would be like jumping off a cliff and not knowing where you're going to land. And I felt that if I was going to leave, at least I knew where I was going to land, even if it wouldn't always be comfortable. Like, I'll give you an example that, again, it doesn't reflect well on me, but I think it was a big lesson that I learned, was that when I was in the corporate world, because it was all new to me and it all just felt like a novelty, I was a bit of a big mouth in terms of, like, I remember getting my first company car, right? And I remember sort of thinking to myself, I think my mum was impressed with it. And I remember sort of saying to her, "No, it doesn't mean anything to me, this. It's all just trappings and I'm not impressed." The day I resigned, Lee, and they came and took that car off me, right, 6 years later, I was shocked at how bereft I felt. And I was shocked at how much I'd allowed it to define me. And I hadn't even realised I was doing it. So I was talking the game. And yet somewhere, unconsciously, I was falling for it, and I was succumbing and allowing myself to be seduced by it. And
what was the car?
A Peugeot, I think. I don't. It was nothing smart. Well, it was smart. Sorry, that sounds flippant, but it wasn't like a big BMW or anything like that. But it was the fact that I'd had a car that like, none of our family could believe it. Somebody's give you that, yeah, apparently. But I was shocked at how bereft I felt, and that was a big lesson for me to go, you've been seduced by the wrong things here, and how long has this kept you where, like, silencing that voice in your head saying, you know, you're in the wrong place here, and it had seduced me for the wrong reasons. And again, it was a big lesson for me to then go, don't, you know, be mindful of not getting caught in the wrong traps, if you like, or things that define you for the wrong reasons. And that's where I think it helps you then manage your own ego, to mean that you don't get carried away with your own importance or your own success. It's about being kind, being decent, being helpful to people is what really defines you, not the car you drive, the clothes you wear, the house you live in.
Completely agree with that. And you know, you must have learned many things, right, and put them into practice. Because whenever I've seen you or interacted, I guess from afar up to now, is the one thing I would say is about humility. And that's the thing that shines through more than anything in the way that you talk and the way that you view others. So complete validation. But I think
thank you.
I think you're saying something really powerful though, in terms of if you just looked at Damian Hughes now, this guy that's always at the perception, always been hugely successful, always had an easy path. That's why I'm really keen actually to have these conversations that goes, what's the reality versus what's the shiny image of the Ferrari as you think of it versus what's the reality.
Well, I think that, and that's why when you explained to me what you were doing with these recordings, I think that's where it's really powerful. That I think we only see part of it for anybody, don't we? We only see a little snippet of it, and that's why I think any conversation like this that just makes people pause and maybe reflect, not on me, but on themselves, and go, right, who am I doing it to, where maybe it's unhelpful for them. I mean, this has been a big thing that we've seen doing the podcasts. So, and I do this podcast series called the High Performance Podcast, where we've been fortunate enough to interview some really impressive people. And the reality is that, again, like you say, you can judge them from the outside and go, oh, they've had it easy, they were talented and it must have been a smooth ride. And we've yet to meet anybody that said that it was a linear journey. It was always bumpy. It was always difficult. And it's in those moments that you find out an awful lot about yourself. They're not moments you welcome, but they're moments that can be really powerful teaching opportunities. We did one this morning, before we came on this, that we interviewed Sol Campbell, the former England footballer. And when I was sort of doing some research, I mean, the amount of people that have got an opinion on him, and it's based on relatively little. You know what I mean? It might have been a throwaway comment he made, or like an interview they saw once. And yet, speaking to him today, I won't claim I have any knowledge of him, but I certainly have a deeper understanding of his life and the struggles he's had, that maybe just gives us all pause for thought and thinks, maybe I'm doing that a bit too frequently. Maybe I do need to stop and think a bit more. That's why social media is a big thing for me over the last 12 months, that I've just removed myself from as much of it as I can. And I'm conscious that I'd signed up to do the podcast with Jake, and then I said to him, I'm coming off social media, so I'm not, and a lot of it is about, can you sort of promote it? And I said, I'll do what I can, but I don't want to be on it an awful lot, because again, social media to me, I was reflecting on it and was thinking, people have got an opinion based on relatively little information. So I'll give you an example that when we first when Jake put a quote out on Twitter, it was a picture of me, him and Rio Ferdinand, because he was the first guest on the podcast. And the first comment underneath it was calling us the C word, so 3 C's. And I remember looking at it, and I was telling my wife about it, and I was like, I'm not sure I fancy this. I'm not sure I fancy putting myself in a position where somebody anonymously can use terms like that about me without there being a consequence. Do you know what I mean? Like when I gave you a bit about my background, that if I was to use words like that as a kid growing up, there's a consequence. Somebody smack you in the mouth, or you're going to have to answer for your actions. And yet it just felt alien to be able to see that people could do that. And it's easy to say, oh, ignore it, but it still takes up mental headspace that you've had to read somebody making an observation about you or a snide comment. So I reflected and I thought, the only way you can do it is just remove yourself from the conversation. So if somebody wants to write a swear word to me now or call me a name, they've got to find my email address. And there's almost a certain accountability that I can either go back and ask them to clarify why they've said that, or to explain my position and try and resolve it. But there's a degree of connection there. But anything on social media, I think, just reduces that connect. The irony is it's supposed to make us more connected, but I think it removes connection more than anything.
Yeah, and it's like anything, isn't it? My simple view is that, and it's really topical right now, isn't it, with all the race issue that's going on, and it is about that word about accountability. the idea that you can put anything out there and not be accountable is just mind blowing in a way. And I never thought about it. And I'm also, I think about my daughter growing up. Like you can focus on yourself and have a reaction to it, but thinking about them and like what would they be and what would you want them to be like really then makes me think of it in a different way.
100%. I think, and the other thing there was two other factors that sort of facilitated my decision to just step away from it. Was I'm a bit like you with the children. So my son got his first phone. He went to big school in September, as much as we can do in a pandemic, but he went to big school, so we promised he could have a phone. And when we had a conversation, he was like, oh, I'm going to get this app and that app. And I was insistent, you're not doing that. I'm not having you on social media. But I thought, I can't be a hypocrite. If he goes, well, you're on it, I can't say I'm doing it for work because it's irrelevant. I'm still on it. So I wanted to role model that. But the other thing was I'd read a really good book. It was based on a paper I'd read years ago by a guy called Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist from Virginia University. And he published this book called The Coddling of the American Mind, where he bases it on research, not opinion, on what growing up online does to us. And what he says is there's three consequences of growing up online on social media. The first one is you end up simplifying the world into good versus bad, right versus wrong. And it's like, but the shades of grey in the middle, but there's no room for that sort of nuance. So if you think of something without being political, like Donald Trump, you either love him or hate him, where the reality is you go, why can I not care? Why can I just not have any opinion on him? Why is it not relevant to me to have a judgment? The world of social media doesn't allow that, so there's no subtlety. The second thing is he talks about this idea of people end up mistaking feelings for facts. So when people go, I feel offended by what he said, well, that's okay. It's a feeling and it'll pass. I haven't done anything to harm you. I've just had an opinion that's different. So people mistake feelings for facts. And then his third factor is he says, when you start mistaking feelings for facts, you have the idea that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. So you never hear conflicting views. You never hear divergent opinions. You never hear diverse reflections because you surround yourself with an echo chamber of people that have similar views. So diversity and difference and distinction don't play much of a part. So that's a bit of an academic reasoning why I just went, you know what, it works on a personal level, but secondly, it's a role model for my son. And then thirdly, like I say, just for accountability, it's just, why would you want to be part of a conversation where somebody can make an observation without the accountability of you being able to respond or to challenge it?
I think there's a bit of an add-on to that, if you will, and this idea of celebrity, if you like, or in public eye, where it is easy to have that judgment or whatever you class as celebrity or in public eye, and then feel like you have to make an opinion about that person. And I think it ties in, but I think there's the added element of celebrity that says, and like I think you alluded to earlier, actually, in your one given moment, you've made that judgment on that person for all that they've done in their life. And I've got a dead quick example of it. Is I met Jonathan Edwards at the London Marathon in about 2004, I think it was.
The triple.
Yeah. So it was in a fleeting moment. I'd seen him from a sporting context, like thinking this guy is absolutely the best thing since sliced bread. And he was just really rude and pushed past me in a fleeting moment.
Right.
And I remember coming away from that thinking, before social media, going, oh, what an idiot. He's not what I thought he was. And actually, what I didn't even stop to consider is what was on his plate. Why was he, rushing in that moment? And I didn't even, not try to approach him. There was no like selfies at that time. It wasn't any of that. I just found him rude in that moment. But that doesn't define who he is as a person, or should have impacted my view of him when I took a step back and went, it was probably just he was rushing from point A to point B.
Yeah, exactly. We had a really good one of this on the podcast. We interviewed Kelly Jones, the lead singer from the Stereophonics, and he was great because he just said, I don't read any. He said, I don't read reviews. I'm not on social media. And he was like, why not? And he's like, well, I don't need validation from people that don't know my story. He said, the people that really matter know what I'm trying to write, know the sound I'm trying to get. So when they've got an opinion, it's relevant for good or bad. But to put it out there and rely on somebody else's view isn't important to me and not helpful. And he gave the example where the lad who set up the band with him, Stuart Brands, had left the band, and he went, and he's been well publicised. He had alcohol and addiction issues, and he'd left the band. But at the time, Kelly said that wasn't my place to reveal why he'd left the band. He'd chosen to do it, and he was battling his own fight privately, and he said, and because I didn't say anything, that silence meant the media labelled him as being a narcissist and being ruthless and sort of manipulative. And he said, I didn't say anything. He said, and because that wasn't my place to comment on Stuart and his struggles. And he said, the first record that they put out after he'd left the band, it was Dakota, and he said it went to #1 in America and over here. He said, and those same people that had been labelling me as a bully and everything like that were then writing that I was better off without him and I never needed him and I was smart and wise and judgmental. And he went, it wasn't right what they said before it, and it wasn't right after it. So he said, so why would I engage in something where people don't know half the story but have an opinion on it? He said, it's a waste of our energy to respond to it or even get caught up with it.
Yeah, amazing. And just on the podcast, I remember being on my activity bike. So last year I did a campaign called Fitter for Full. So I lost 4 stone, 4 pounds.
Oh wow, brilliant!
To drive my purpose to be around longer as a dad and as a husband. So when you were saying that earlier, it resonated. But I remember being on the activity bike and I was listening to the Johnny Wilkinson episode, and there's not many times, Damian, in my life where I've gone, wow, just wow. It kind of, and I went cold listening to it, and it washed out, and I must have had to listen to the 3 or 4 times.
Oh, really?
I wrote the episode down and kind of gone through it, but I found it fascinating. And I just was wondering about I was really curious around how did you feel in that moment listening to him live versus what other people had said?
Yeah. Oh, well, first of all, thanks for listening. It was an amazing episode. So the context behind it was he'd come on and we're down at Pennyhill Park in Surrey where the England team train. And so I knew the hotel, I knew the area, and he turned up on his own, no entourage, anything like that. And we had all our questions prepared, and it was about his career and lessons learned and things like that. And very quickly, it was his answer to the first question, which was, we always ask what is high performance, and he went, I can't answer that. High performance is subjective. And very quickly, Jake and I just closed our laptops, bundled up our questions, and went, just let him go with this. I don't think this is going to go where we want. So how I felt was, there was 2 emotions that were really quite predominant in my thoughts. One was I felt really privileged, that he would trust us to come and feel he could open up and speak so candidly and honestly about his mental health struggles. So for those people that haven't heard it, that are listening to this, he spoke about he survived his career. He said, I endured it rather than enjoyed it. And he spoke about the mental health challenges that his career had sort of precipitated. So I remember feeling quite humbled and privileged that, wow, he's trusting us here to speak so candidly. And then the second thing I felt was just like, I just really admired him, because I just thought it took courage to come and say, I'm not the person I was when I won the World Cup in 2003, and that's not the person that defines me. And even though it might be your public perception, I'm a different person today than I was then. And I remember thinking that just takes real courage to do that, to come and live life on your terms, not on somebody else's, not to play the game because it's what people expect of you. And there was a nice bit at the end of it that literally we'd packed up and we were sort of making small talk and just talking about families and things like that. And he made a request to Jake and I where he said, please don't edit this to make me look like a dick, because there were so many bits on it that if you wanted to take it out of context or deliberately be malicious, you could misrepresent it. And what really moved me was I thought, you've waited till the end, you've given us all that, and you've trusted us, and then you've just asked us, please don't make me look silly on the back of this. Which was why when Jake and myself and the production team sat down afterwards, we said, you know what, we almost have a duty here. Just put it out as is. So don't do any editing of it. So normally the podcast, we try and bring them in for between 45 minutes and an hour. And on this one, we went, let it run. So I think it's something like nearly 90 minutes long. But it was based on the fact that he trusted us. It was like, we're not going to abuse that trust. Give him just a platform to explain in the context that he chose to do it. So privilege was one emotion, admiration at the courage of it, and then just being really moved that he was prepared to be so open.
Yeah, amazing. And it resonates with me, and I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't call out at this stage. You know, I've put things on LinkedIn about my own mental health journey and challenges.
Right, okay.
And I think that was where the true connection was. But to hear it from someone so prominent that wasn't just a footballer, actually, because that's my natural go-to.
Yeah.
Although I love all sport and I've listened to all the episodes of the podcast, but it seemed to me that it was at a different level and at a deeper level that resonated for me, really. But also about the most powerful thing for me actually was don't live so your past is not what defines you, like moving forward. And I thought that was really powerful.
Well, they had that point where he just said, if you define yourself as being like the guy that won the World Cup for England, he said, 10 minutes after you've won the World Cup, you're a lesser person. 10 months after it, you're even less still. 10 years after it, you're diminishing yourself. And that to me was really powerful, because I see like a lot of former sports people, like even 20 years after they retired, still defining themselves, I'm former Ireland international, or we interviewed the other day, and it's like, well, you are, but you're so many other things as well. Who are you now? Who is the person that you are today, was his point, not who were you 20 years ago. So when he made that point where he said, washing up the dishes at home to me is just as important as kicking that penalty 20 years ago or whenever it was. He went, I'm using my body to fulfill a task. But at this moment, the most important thing is washing those dishes the best I possibly can. And I know that might surprise some people, because we're used to that narrative of let's recount all our yesterdays, let's recount our successes, and to have somebody come along and go, don't want to do that. That's not the person I am today. So if you wanted to know that, you should have interviewed me 17 years ago. Right, fair enough.
Brilliant. And final thing, really conscious of your time, and really appreciate it. And I'm not going to edit this. This is a one-take wonder. So if you've been rubbish, you've been rubbish. I'm sorry.
Use some languages. You just bleep them bits out. My mum will kill me if she knows swearing.
What do you do for fun?
What do I do for fun? Oh, right. I'll tell you one that back in 2019, at the end of 2019, the kids had been asking for years about a dog. Can we get a dog? Can we get a dog? And I've never grown up with animals or anything like that, so I was always resistant to it, just because commitment and things like that. And then we did this thing. The kids were persistent, and I was saying, "Oh, I'm allergic," which I am. And they said, "Oh, you can get a dog that doesn't have allergies." So that removed that excuse. So I said, I'll tell you what we did. We did this thing called Borrow My Doggy, where you can like look after people's dogs, and we did that for the kids. And there was one night I was taking this dog out for a walk, and it was about 8:30, and it was a nice summer evening. But I was out in the park on my own with the dog, and the sun was setting. And I just felt such a sense of peace, just tranquility. And I was thinking, if I hadn't had this dog, I wouldn't be out here at this time. There'd be no reason for me to be walking across this park, this field with him. So I came home and said to my wife, let's do it. We'll go for it. So we got a dog called Teddy, his little cockapoo, nearly 18 months or so ago now. And if I'd have heard me saying this 18 months ago, I'd have laughed at me, but I love him to bits. Me and him, I just love the sense of peace that me and him of an evening. Like when the kids would say, "Could I come with you?" I go, no, you stay here, I'll do it. Because I love just me and him going out on our own, sort of, and we walk for miles, and we don't say a word. We're just like easy companions with each other. But the amount of troubles I've solved in my head, or the amount of stuff I've worked out just by doing that on my own, he's been my most recent thing that that adds a huge amount of satisfaction and fun to me. So there's a number of other things, but I like reading. I like sort of writing and trying to capture ideas in a way that could be fun. That genuinely does feel like a pleasure to me. But going out with Teddy on our walks is a huge addition to my life over the last 18 months.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, I know loads of people like bore with dog stories, so I don't want to do that. But it was the sense of peace that I get from his company that really is special.
Oh, it's amazing. And I think we've all got attuned to like the things that matter the most to us in the most simplest way, going right back to the beginning of what we were talking about, right? So
yeah, definitely.
Massively appreciate your time. It's been amazing.
Oh, I've loved it. As I said at the start, I really admire what you're trying to do with it, Lee. I think this social glue of just speaking to other human beings and having the time to ask really nice questions, smart, incisive questions like you've asked, and then giving the honour of just listening is a real privilege. So thank you for having me along.
Cheers, pal.
Thanks, mate.
I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, look forward to it.